What up? What up? It's your man Sean P coming in live. Once again, this is the Sean P Experience on YouTube with another exciting guest. Oh my God, I keep on getting blessed to be able to connect with these people and talk to these people. It's a blessing. I'm a fan of all of my guests, so this is a big fan moment in real time. You seeing it on the screen, man. I have the one and only Deesha Philyaw in the building, y'all. Give us some virtual hand claps
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
for the sister. For the sister, let me do your official introduction to be professional. Here we go. Deesha Philyaw's debut short story collection, The Secret Life of Church Ladies, won the 2021 Ken Faulkner Award for Fiction, the 2020-2021 Story Prize, and the 2020 LA Times Book Prize. Right? It was a finalist for the 2020 National Book Award for Fiction. The Secret Life of Church Ladies focuses on black women, sex, and the black church. It is being adapted for television by HBO Max by Tisa Thompson, who I am crazy about. I love that sister. Executive producing. Her debut novel, The True Confessions of the First Lady Freeman, is a forthcoming from Mariner Books, an imprint of HarperCollins. That's in 2025. We will be highly anticipating that book. Welcome to the show.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you, Sean. I am excited to be here with you. And one quick correction, my book got pushed to 2026, the novel. So we got an extra year, giving me a little more time to make it even more special. Oh, Resist Books is
Yeah,
here.
my man Demetrius Frazier out there in Virginia. Shout out to Demetrius Frazier with this booksellers. Going to support your independent bookstores. Yes. So I try to start my show off uniquely with every guest I have. So for you, I want to ask this question.
Mhm.
You're from Jacksonville. V.
Duval. Yes.
Duval. So first of all, for those that don't know, I'm a military veteran. I was stationed in Jacksonville on the John F. Kennedy, 2004, something like that.
Hmm.
So I learned that our sister Zora Neale Hurston went to school at one time in Jacksonville. I learned that in Dr. Imani Perry, South to America.
Hmm.
And then also our brother James Weldon Johnson and his brother, two intellectual giants out of
Yes.
Jacksonville. So my question for you is, how do you feel coming up in that tradition of intellectual
Sure.
power of Jacksonville? And do you feel any kind of pressure or weight from that, or do you not think about
No, I definitely think about it. And I feel like, they were slept on, uh, greatly. They should be, all of them should be household names, not just, Zora Neale Hurston. But I think people do sleep on Duval. And I was commenting on that in an interview with the LA Times a few years ago. We were prepping, we hadn't started taking the interview officially. We were just chatting, me and the reporter. And I don't know what prompted me to say this, but I was, bragging. I was like, the three hottest books out right now, three Black women from Duval. It was me, Donnie Walton, with the final revival of Opal and Nev, and Dontiel W. Moniz with Milk Blood Heat, all from Jacksonville. I was like, and we haven't gotten any press for that, not even any hometown love. So then all the hometown media hit us up because that interviewer, even though that was sort of an off the cuff, throwaway comment, she led with that.
that? Hmm.
And so that brought that attention. And so people are like, oh, Duval. But, not only is that there that literary legacy that you mentioned, but I had the pleasure earlier this spring to go to the Douglas Anderson School for the Arts Literary Festival that they hold at the school every
Hmm.
other year. And they hadn't held it since COVID. And so they were back for the first time with me and Nicole Seeley and Dantil and other writers there with the students, because as an art school, they've got, music and dance and drama and so forth. And they have a writing program. And the parents there have a booster club, just like for football, to support their children in the literary arts. And they bring in nationally renowned writers to spend a Saturday with the students. And it was one of the best festivals I've ever attended. And I was so heartened that it was in my hometown, because that wasn't my experience of Jacksonville. I went to a college prep public magnet school in Jacksonville. I got a great education, but I didn't get a great literary education. And so to know that that school is there and it's, they're nurturing a new generation of writers from Jacksonville is really exciting, including Black writers. There were two young Black women who introduced me and Nicole throughout the day for our different events, who are writers in their own right. They had read Kiese's work. We were talking about Kiese earlier, and and like their heroes are literary heroes. And so one of the young women after my workshop, she said, can you tell Kiese? I said, well, tell him yourself. And I texted him, and I handed her my phone. And she got to say to him, like, what it meant to her as a young Black Southern fat woman to read his memoir. And then have him respond to her right in the moment. And so that was priceless. So all of that to say,
no,
don't sleep on Jacksonville.
Yeah. And it's funny how life works. You waste your youth, right? They say you waste your youth all the time.
Yeah.
So I was a late bloomer when it comes to reading. I always say I'm a late bloomer in this. So when I was in Jacksonville, I had no idea about that being there. I was in the military. I was 19, 20 years old, doing
what all the NAS Jacks.
Bruh. I'm going to the club.
I know what was going on the base.
This was never T.I. lighting up, you know what I'm saying? Everything is, we got all the Haitians and the Caribbean people that are going to all the Jamaican spots. So, I mean, I wasn't even thinking about that when I was there,
Yeah.
I really regret that, but I definitely got to go back and see it with my mature eyes, right?
Absolutely.
Let's keep it in the South, though. I love asking Kieske this question. I asked Dr. Montefiore this kind of a question. Maurice Ruffin.
Yes.
The old school perception about the South when it comes to intellect, creativity, when it comes to music and everything else. How do you feel about combating that stereotype? Like the South is supposed to be like backwards and we behind, slow. How do you feel about that?
I really don't think about it. I feel like our work speaks for itself. And I think that Zora Neale Hurston put that to rest years ago when she wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God, and Alain Locke, who's an intellectual, who decided that her book was sort of quaint, but he didn't see Black folkways, and I translated Black Southern folkways as high art, as worthy of literature. And so he was sort of condemning her with faint praise in a review of that book in some publication. And so Zora Neale Hurston wrote a rebuttal to that, but the publication wouldn't publish it. So she just wrote him a letter and was like, I will send my toenail clippings to debate you about what you know about Black life. And so it's like, we clap back, but I think we clap back through our art, her art and the persistence of it and the legacy of it. I mean, we know that it needed to be revived and revisited, and we do again and again. But it has that staying power. So I think our work, the caliber of our work, the importance of our work, and not to get into what's high art and highbrow, lowbrow. Tyler Perry tried to go there with us this week about that. The art speaks for itself. Our resilience speaks for itself. Our singularity as Southern artists speaks for itself.
You spoke a little while ago about doing that interview, mentioning the Jacksonville writers, and then people realizing, like, wait a minute. And Southern writers in general, since the pandemic, I tell my friends all over, some of the best writers of right now on the list, they're Southern writers. Imani Perry, once again, Jamila Minix, and all these other people we can name. All this Southern power that we have, it is not talked about enough.
Yes.
In national press, like you said, it's not talked about.
And that's why I love many things I love about Kiese is, he leads with in his bio, I'm a Black Southern writer from Jackson, Mississippi. And I think more of us need to, lead with that, to remind people, because there is that misconception that the writers you're hearing about, the writers who are on the list, the writers who are getting the book deals and so forth, that we're based in New York, that we're from, a certain culture, or certain region, that we studied at a certain school, or whatever. I don't have an MFA, for example. And so I think, as Southerners, we've always been resourceful. We've always made a way. And it's not always the traditional way. We, charting our own paths. And so I think articulating that, and reminding the people.
Getting it from the mud for real, right?
Yes.
Literally. Um, your book was copyrighted 2020. Of course,
Yes.
COVID-19, all the protests.
Yeah.
How do you imagine your book rolling out different, like if it wasn't the pandemic and all this stuff? Like, do you
Yeah.
imagine it as far as like I would guess like your book tour and
Hmm.
opportunities, even maybe even sales and units. I don't
Yeah.
know. How do you imagine that if it wasn't COVID?
Right. I think I really had a captive audience. People were at home, booksellers and book conferences and festivals, were all virtual. And so the book was able to reach people, and I was able to reach people by doing events like this, all virtual. And I never would have had the same reach or contact with an audience of that size if the world hadn't paused and we were all connected via Zoom. So since then, once the world opened up again, I did I have been touring physically, in person I should say. But I know that it was because of what was happening that the book got that initial audience. I have heard from people that, um, reading the book, even though it's not an entirely happy book, that people said that they escaped into this book during that really terrifying time. I don't know that it was necessarily comforting, but it did allow some sweetness and some escapism into their lives. So I'm sorry that this has happened to us, that we are facing that we are still in this pandemic, whether people want to own it or not.
Definitely, definitely,
It's still
definitely.
tragic, that what caused us to pause. But we did pause, and all, myself included, we were all reading more. We were all taking more workshops because they were more online. We were all listening to authors we love and discovering authors that we would not have discovered otherwise. um,
Yeah.
and what's interesting is someone did an article following up on how all of those books that were like the anti-racist books that were on the bestseller list during that year. And I take nothing away from those writers getting that amount of getting those sales and whatnot, but this follow-up article showed a lot of those books were returned and a lot of those books were not read.
Wow,
And
that's
so I
crazy.
think people, some of the reading that folks did, reading writers that were, different from them, and writers that they were discovering, like Columbus, that it was out of, also that moment, a time of reckoning and guilt and, what can I do? And I didn't know, and, trying to address some of our ignorance about what's really been happening, for centuries. But Church Ladies was different. You know, Church Ladies is not an anti-racist book, but it is a Black book.
Yes, it is.
So I'm pretty sure the people who bought it read it. I don't think they send it back.
No, no. But
They- it was not, and I think what I want to say is I don't want to take away from those books. I just want to emphasize that point. But purchasing some of those books was white people virtue signaling. Um, and I don't think that Church Ladies was a virtue signal purchase. I think people were, who are not Black women, who are not Black Southern women, who are not Black church women, were in some cases pleasantly surprised at how much they could connect to the book without me having to dilute it or translate culture or interpret things for them. It was like, oh, I got a grandmama. I'm hearing from women in Greece that, oh, that reminds me of my grandmother, or I experienced shame, You know, I experienced body issues, or I had a difficult relationship with my mother. All those things are in church ladies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I want to also add to that. You mentioned in one of your podcasts with Kiese the power of the online community getting that
Yes.
traction. People like the Stacks podcast and other
Yes.
Bookstagrammers out there.
Hmm.
But people that joined Bookstagram recently, I'm always telling them, man, during the pandemic, you had to be there. Like
Yeah.
people were going live every day, and because it was lockdown, your favorite authors in there kicking it with us, like
Kicking it.
Honorary Jeffers,
Mhm.
Kiese, my man Robert Jones, our brother. All these authors were in there with us every day, kicking it for hours at a time, and
Yeah.
it was incredible
And
that
then
closeness that we had.
you said you were asking me earlier about, you know, that particular moment and how it impacted the book. You know, in that moment, um Achille and Reggie, like you, they were doing lives, and before they brought their show onto YouTube,
That's my boys.
somebody was like, hey, there are these two black men who have devoted 2 episodes of their live show to your book,
Yeah.
4 hours
Yes.
talking about
Yes.
my 9 stories. And I
Yes.
didn't know them. I didn't know them at
That's
all.
what they
And I,
do.
maybe
They
they
do.
heard about Church
They
Ladies
do.
from the Stacks podcast. I'm
They
not
do.
sure how it happened, but I didn't know them. And it was a surreal experience because I listened to all 4 hours,
Yeah.
listened to them
They are amazing.
analyze it,
They are
each
amazing.
story, you know,
Hmm.
and that made me feel like, wait, I think this book might be something special.
Yeah. Yeah. And let me take like 7 to 10 seconds to give them full props and praise. I tell
Yes.
people all the time, those guys are really the flag bearers for a person like myself.
Yes.
I was doing what I was doing way before Instagram, but somebody was
Mhm.
like, bro, you got to see these guys. Like,
Yes.
you got to holler at them. And now both
Yes.
of those guys have been total friends to me
Mhm.
offline, and they
Mhm.
help me and direct me a lot in private, man. So I want to do that publicly on my show. If you
Yes.
haven't seen those guys, go to Books of Pop Culture. They are the flag carriers when it comes to black men doing
Absolutely.
this literary space, man. Sure, shout out.
Absolutely.
Um, this is a great segue that naturally happened. It's not a part of the show.
Mhm.
How did men in general receive this book? Let me tell you why I asked this question. So the past 3 years, I'm a late bloomer, reading a lot of Toni Morrison,
Mhm.
Alice Walker, Sister Zora, a lot of our giants, and then now reading this book. If a guy picks up these books and just read them, and
Yeah.
you're trying to find this like guy to emulate, this great guy to look up to, you might not find that because a lot of times for the guys don't go good. It don't go too good for the guys. So how do guys receive this book?
Sure. So, you know, I have a couple of thoughts. One of my earliest readers was my friend Caleb out of Louis. He's from New Orleans, and he's I guess he would be a millennial. I'm 52. Caleb's younger than me, so he was reading Church Ladies before it came out. He had he had an arc, and he said so many things. Like his analysis of the book blew my mind. Again, unexpected. I don't. It's not that I didn't expect men to read it, but I did not know that they would read it as deeply as they did. And you know, and Demetrius, you know, also having you know, a group of black men reading my book and me coming onto that podcast, like my mind was just blown, just
Yeah.
absolutely blown, and I was so thankful. But Caleb
I'm
was
a
the
card
first.
carrying member of the Black Men Reading.
Yes, Caleb was the first. And he told me, he said, you know, I thought I was about to get into something nasty. And he was like, some erotica. He said, and there was that. He was like, but then he said, I also heard the ancestors speaking. It didn't matter. I appreciate all the awards and attention that the book has gotten, but that observation, that feeling, that experience he had of my book, that was everything to me to hear him say that. So he was one of the first men to read it. My friend Damon Young, my Pittsburgh homie, because I spent 25 years in Pittsburgh, he was also one of the first to read an early copy of the book. And one of the first people I did an interview with about it in the book. I don't even know if the book had come out yet. And he said, men are garnish in this book. He said, we own the plate, but we're not the meal. And in that conversation, we were like, yeah, that's kind of how we should all be reading, like however you identify. I think when we talk about reading more broadly, for me, I try and make sure that I'm reading books where I am not the center, that I am the margin, right? So I am,
Mm.
cisgender. So I need books on my library that are by trans writers, so that their experience is centered and not marginalized. Those are the books that I'm trying to read. I'm taking a page out of Damon's book, because when he said it, I could see it, and I was like, I think we all should be reading that way, where we're not centered. What can we take away from that experience? Now, I will say, to your observation, yes, there are men that don't come off well, but I will always shout out Eric Turman from How to Make Love to a Physicist. I created my perfect man. He is my perfect man. And so if men are looking for an example or role model, or, what do women want? At least this woman, it's Eric.
I was
Yeah.
I was considering the character Tony, right?
Yes. And Tony.
I considered Tony, but Tony was like 2 times divorced already prior to that point in the story.
Me too. What you trying to say?
I'm not saying nothing. I'm just saying. The next question.
No. Okay, so what I'll say about that is, though, I think it's all narrative and framing, because a
Yeah.
lot of times it doesn't mean that, he wasn't a good man. I will guess, because I don't know. I created him, but I didn't think
Yeah,
that
what's
deep.
the Tony backstory? Tony
Yeah,
backstory.
I'm gonna give Tony a backstory. He just
Okay.
wasn't with the right woman yet. He just hadn't met
Okay.
the right one. I think he was a stand-up guy. Maybe the first
Yeah.
one he was too
Yeah.
young. Maybe it was a shotgun wedding. We don't, I think, but Tony was a good dude too.
He was a
Yes.
good dude. The tenderness he showed to her
Yes.
mom, and because even
Yeah.
her own son didn't want to deal with her talking about Ellen Levert and all that, but Tony
Yes.
would play into it, and you gonna look good, and of course he was that space that the main character needed. So he
Exactly.
definitely had all these amazing qualities.
Yes.
Shout out to
And
Tony.
Uncle Bird in Dear Sister. Uncle
Yes.
Bird. And Uncle Bird had the best line. He was like, "You the only nigga I know that got call his kids like a spades hand, foreign or possible." So
Yeah.
he had his
Yeah.
own, tenderness. We saw him as a man openly grieving, his brother, and trying to be there for his nieces to the extent that he could. So I'm gonna throw Uncle Bird in there too.
Okay, Uncle Bird. Backstory. Okay. This I want to ask you next, right? So the church life period. Of course, me growing up in two very religious households,
Mm-hmm.
both sides of the family, the church world could be very like ironclad,
Mm-hmm.
all of these taboos and what you can't do, this and that.
Yeah.
And of course, there's always that parallel dynamic of which you want to be liberated. You want to have your
Mm-hmm.
own life. So tell
Mm-hmm.
me about like how you go about writing these stories and finding these voices. Like how difficult is that? Question.
They just live in me. I mean, I was churched the first 35 years of my life. Even though my mother and grandmother didn't go to church, and I kind of figured out, probably not until Church Ladies came out, because they passed away in 2005. I don't think they went because I think they didn't go because they felt unwelcome as two women who had children without being married. But they weren't rejecting the church or its teachings, because they sent me, though. Like, I could still be salvaged under those hypocritical, rules, those double standards, because you were talking about rules about what you could and couldn't do, but there were different set of rules for boys and girls, and men and women, and so my family wasn't, my mother and my grandmother, who also raised me, they weren't rejecting that, because they still sent me to church. And so from the time I was little, all I've ever known is women inside the church, women outside the church. And I learned early on that if you are quiet and you don't say anything, because you know how it is in our households, be seen and not heard, you could hear all kinds of stories. So I heard everybody's business, and whatever I didn't understand or didn't know, I could imagine for myself. So I have always been curious about how women navigated those rules around sexuality, all the things that you're not supposed to do, everything in you that's human and healthy, it's just human nature to desire, to have physical and sexual urges. And so I wondered, like, well, how did they manage it when their husbands died or they didn't, have a man? Did they masturbate? So I'm at the church, like checking these women out, like wondering, what's going on. And then also wondering, because it's like, well, who am I going to become? Right? Because I want to be a good girl. I don't want to go to hell, but it looks like the women who are going to hell, according to the church, they're having all the fun and they have, they're wearing the clothes I want to wear. So it was a lot of binary kind of thinking that is very confusing for a child, because humans, we're not, binary beings all the time. So, so I carried that with me into my adulthood. I did everything right. Initially, I got married before I had kids. I married a man, and then but there was not this prize at the end for me. I was still very dissatisfied. And I wrote that dissatisfaction, I gave it to my characters, because at the time I wasn't brave enough to write nonfiction about how I was feeling.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Let's tease that a little bit, right? So
Okay.
this collection of stories, you had a bunch of stories like prior to, correct? And then it came together over time. It kind of
Yeah.
matured together. So
When I
give me kind
started
of a
writing,
time frame on the arc of that.
sure. I was trying to write a novel actually since 2007. The novel that's going to come out in 2026, I started that in 2007 and took so many different detours. And among those detours was writing short stories. And I didn't think I was doing anything in particular other than procrastinating and not working on my novel. I had an agent because my first book was actually a co-parenting book with my ex-husband. And she was like, when you're ready with that novel, I'm ready for it. And she was helping me and I was getting stuck. And she also knew about these stories. So she said, I like these church lady stories. That's what she called them. She saw like a through line. It was just two. It was like Eula and maybe not Daniel, maybe Peach Cobbler. I forget what the second was, but the first one was definitely Eula. And she said, if you can get 3 stories published in literary journals, we can take this collection out as a partial manuscript. And I felt like I can do that. I had no idea how to finish this novel, but I felt like I can write and get 3 stories published. So by the time I got 3 stories published, I had written 6. So my partial manuscript has 6 stories in it. And she, took it out. We disagree, my agent and I, on who came up with the title. I think it's her. She thinks it's me. It was one of us. And we went out with that partial and it got rejected everywhere. Like we were breaking all the rules, right? People will tell you partials don't sell. People will tell you short story collections don't sell, at least not as your first book. But my agent was like, this is what we're going to do, because I wasn't finished with the novel. I wasn't finishing, and she wasn't, going to say, well, you can't do anything until you finish that novel. She met me where I was. So we went out. Everybody said no, except West Virginia University Press. They saw a vision for that book, and they came back and said, we would like it to be 35,000 words. So keep writing. And so I pulled out one of the stories that I didn't think was as strong as the others and wasn't as good of a fit. And then I kept writing more stories, building on stories that I had started and were just kind of sitting in a file, started a couple of things brand new. And by the time I got to 35,000 words, I had 9 stories. I was like, I have a collection. And that's how it came about.
So a lot of my audience, and why I do this show, is
Mm-hmm.
for other writers out there watching this and people
Mm-hmm.
that want to write, and you're giving them advice. So I love whenever the author comes on that's well accomplished. All the stuff we said in the intro, and you talk about all this rejection. So
Yes.
give some advice to anybody when they're worried about the rejection, the fear of the rejection.
Right.
And every author come on here talk about how many times they were rejected, how many
Mm-hmm.
folks said it wouldn't work, and now it's
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
So give us the in between question.
Yeah. I think that, one of the reasons that we struggle with rejection is because we don't embrace that it is part of the process, right? That we think that, oh, I have this story, it's amazing. All my friends told me it's amazing. I'm going to send it to the Atlantic. And then when it gets rejected, it's like, oh my God, I'm a failure. that's literally me, right? I have never in my life written anything that's right for the Atlantic. I don't even know if they publish fiction anymore, but that for whatever reason in my head, I was going to write stories and they were going to be published in the Atlantic. And of course I got rejected. And I was thinking about publication in a way that wasn't helpful. I was thinking about success in a way that wasn't helpful, which was, I'm not successful unless I'm published in the Atlantic. And rare is the person that's their first publication. I mean, or something, or the New Yorker. I mean, it happens, but that's not the typical path. And so I had to kind of reevaluate, and this is the advice part, just reevaluating your relationship to success, your relationship to the writing process, and understand that it's a process. I think too often people are like, I am writing, I need to publish in a high profile place, and I need to get a big book deal, and I need to get awards. Like they're already there. And there's like a whole journey that leads there, possibly, right? None of that is guaranteed. And so what I found was I felt better once I started enjoying the process. And it's like, oh, I love storytelling. I don't want to do anything else. I was prepared. If nobody wanted Church Ladies, I was going to self-publish Church Ladies because I just wanted to finish the book of work of fiction. I've been trying to write fiction at that point for nearly 20 years. I had taken all these detours into nonfiction to make a living and all of this. So I was like, I just want to finish because I love these stories and these characters. I don't want to do anything else with my life but this. And it wasn't about awards or anything like that. I had known writers in private spaces who had the awards and the deals and the accolades and were absolutely miserable. And I just remember thinking, because you know what, because there's always one more award. You got this one, but somebody else got that one. And so I made up my mind. I was like, if I ever get something published, I'm going to consider that my success. Because the awards, you can't control that. And now that I've been judging awards and things like that, I know more than anything. It's so fickle. It's completely subjective. Like we haven't even started talking about bias, right? I haven't had any situations where I've witnessed bias other than like just the natural bias of this is the kind of writing I like. But like no, racial, I've not experienced or been a party to that. And I also know that if they send us 100 books, that doesn't only mean that 2 are good. It means that they have 2 awards, and that it could be 98 other amazing books, or the New York Times bestseller list. Those aren't the best books. Those aren't the only good books, And so what can you, as the writer, what can you control so that you don't give your joy, your happiness, your sense of accomplishment over to other people who on a whim, just having a bad day, just like, nope, I don't like this one. And it's on to the next thing, And so I was like, I don't want anybody to have that much power over me. And so, so thankfully for me, I had a sense of accomplishment finishing the stories. And I felt good about them. Dantil Moniz always says that she is her first reader. She is her first critic. She has to love it. And once I love it, nobody can really tell me anything. I'm good. I'm golden. Everything else is gravy. So my wish and my advice for other writers is find your joy in this process. But that also forces us to interrogate why we're doing this, right? Because it's like, am I doing this because I love it and because I want to get these stories out there? Or am I doing it because I need validation or I want so-and-so to approve of me or what? Like that puts a lot of pressure on the work, when it's like, I'm going to show them, or I think that the writing is going to fill this hole inside of me. Anne Lamott told us, she was like, whatever mental illness you have while you're writing this book, once it comes out, it's going to be exacerbated. Like whatever you're struggling with, if you got mommy issues, your mommy issues are going to get worse after you publish this because you've got to reckon with it all. The book doesn't solve whatever it is. And it's too much pressure on the book because good books take time to write. So all of this is leading to take your time. Most writers I know are in a hurry because they're not writing for the love of it. They're writing for the validation, or they're writing because they're trying to make a living at it. That's another thing. I know very few people who make writers who make a living at just writing. They're teaching, they're doing
Yep.
something else. They're married to somebody who has some money and health insurance. That's the real tea. But trying to then force this to become your primary source of income, that for me, I will say, and most people I know, that's too much pressure on the books because the books take time. I was telling you at the top of the show, oh, my book is slated to come out in 2026 now, not 2025. That has financial implications, right? And so, all of these things are out of our control. And so, writing is not going to be the sure thing. And I think that's another misconception that people have.
I met Demetrius Fraser in the building. He asked for shout out to the chat first of all.
Mhm.
What's your experience and advice to authors when the book doesn't find readership right away? The book doesn't find.
Yeah. So I my experience, and I don't know that this is true for everybody who's with us today, but when I think about the writers who in the end their book didn't find a readership right away, there were one of two things happening. One, that's very common because the reality is it's not about how good the book is or what the subject matter is. It comes down to marketing and promotion and exposure, which costs a lot of money, and most writers just don't have it. And even if they're with a traditional publisher, you don't know how much the publisher is going to invest in helping the book find its readership. So some of it you couldn't have written the book any differently, and then, oh, that was the thing that kept the readership away. No, it comes down to dollars, which is unfortunate. The other thing that I have observed happening is when writers do that thing where they're rushing, and when they have not taken the book through what I think of as like sort of its pacing, which is I started talking earlier about examining your relationship to success. It's also your relationship to critique and to the process of writing and workshop. So Toni Morrison said that, critique and feedback, failure, all of that, it's just information. But most of us don't receive it as information. We receive it as an affront. We receive it as, someone was saying we don't know in our current age the difference between someone just being critical of us and criticizing us and someone critically using critical thinking and applying it to our work and analyzing our work and observing and reviewing our work. It's not them being critical or criticizing us, but a lot of times because we don't make that distinction, we shy away from critique that can actually help us fine tune our work, which is can also help the work find its readership. So I am always astonished at the number of people who want to ask me about finding an agent or finding a publisher, and no one but like their best friend or maybe their spouse has read the work. Like they've got no other critical feedback. And so I'm like, but like you want your work the best it can be before you approach an agent, before you approach a publisher, before you approach an editor at a literary journal. And that again takes time. And so if we're in a hurry or we don't like, or we're not comfortable receiving critique, then the book isn't going to be its best and it's not going to find its readership. Again, that's something we can fix. The other thing, there is also space for serendipity. People have written books and then something happens in the world and suddenly their book, that's the topic,
Come
um,
on, man.
but when
Yes.
that doesn't happen, it's like, how can we create those moments? And so some of it, I've been telling people who are, need to do their own marketing. Who else is writing in your space? Who else is writing around, similar topics? And don't believe the lie that publishing wants us to believe, that we are in competition with each other. Like, no, we can collaborate. And if I got a little bit of audience and you got a little bit of audience, and we're both writing about Black women's health, mental health, then let's bring those audiences together and do an event together. Let's go on live, or let's, something where we come together and combine our resources.
Mhm. I was thinking about the book Bridgerton. The book was written like 20 plus years ago, right? And then Shonda Rhimes saw it, and
Mm-hmm.
then of course I'm sure the sales went crazy 20
Yeah,
years later,
right.
but
And the other way I would answer Demetrius's question is um, move on to your next project. Move on to the next thing. Or in my case, I always have multiple things going anyway. And so all my eggs are not in one basket ever.
yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am. Let's talk about the story. My favorite story in the whole book,
Okay.
personally. Well, it's up there. Not Daniel.
Okay.
Not Daniel. I love that story, man.
Yes.
Two people, right? Their mothers are in hospice care, very
Hmm.
dire situation, and they find this peace with each other, in the female lead's car for this small period of time.
Yep.
And another story in the book, the story with Tony, the car is like this
Yes.
incubator of peace. Talk about the two people needing that person
Yeah.
for just that one thing. Because even the character in Not Daniel, he's married, by the way.
Yes. Yes.
But they come together for these getaway moments from the phone and the doctors,
Hmm. Yes.
caretakers, and nurses. Man, like it really really hit home for me. Talk
Yeah.
about that.
I mentioned Anne Lamott. She wrote this book called Bird by Bird, which for a lot of writers is sort of like the writing Bible, writing advice Bible. And one of the things she talks about is seeing a moment, and this can be a fictional moment or a non-fictional moment, in a one by one picture frame, like the smallest picture frame you can find. And so when I have my characters in a particular scene, I'm trying to have it be as close as possible. So in the case of the two scenes you're mentioning, it's they're in a car, you know. And so just trying to zero in on these very intimate moments. And then you can build the rest of the story out from there, but making sure to have those moments. That's how I find out who those characters are. Like, what do they do in those intimate spaces? Because my first, second, sometimes even third draft, I'm telling myself the story. I'm still figuring out, like, who is this? Why are they there? What's motivating them? What do they want? Um, and so it's when I pull them into those close spaces that I'm like, okay, that's what that's about. And then I kind of know and can intuit, sort of reverse engineering. Oh, here's where they came from. Here's why they did and said that in the moment. Here is who else is in their ecosystem. So we know that in How to Make Love to a Physicist, we meet Lyra, and she's meeting Eric at this conference, and they see each other on the escalator, sort of passing, and then they're in this work panel discussion, and then they sit down and they talk. But she's got her mother, who is a critical figure in her life, who is chastising her about her body and not having a man and how she shows up in the world. She's a teacher. She's an art teacher. And so all of that is brought to bear when she's talking to this man, because she's not confident in those moments. She's enjoying it. But as soon as it's over, because of everything else in her world, she's like, she sabotages it. Right. So I put her in that situation and then blew it up because of what's going on, around her. But then leaning into the art, right? So she's an art teacher. So what does he do? She's ghosted him. She's not answering his calls. He sends her an art book. That's how he gets back in there. So yeah, so it's like starting in these intimate spaces and then building out their worlds.
So of course we all deal with grief and everything in different ways, right?
Hmm.
So talk about that piece. I'm a psychology major, so I'm always going to the psychology. Like them using this intimacy,
Yeah.
that's like their way of dealing with what's going on with them,
Yeah.
what's happening in their life outside the car.
Hmm.
If anybody ever experienced that, I know I have personally.
Yeah.
You're dealing with this thing, and it comes out in a physical manner sometimes.
Hmm.
Speak on that if you can.
Sure. I mean, I'm so glad you asked this question, because we don't talk enough about that in this culture, that the um the acceptable and orthodox ways that we allow people to grieve, it could fit in a box this big, right? Like it's very small. But most of us who have experienced deep grief know that it shows up, it manifests, we act out in ways that don't fit in that box. And then on top of the grief, now we maybe got a little guilt, maybe we got a little shame because it didn't, we couldn't, we got to keep that to ourselves. Everybody's there and saying all these, platitudes, but there's nobody we can be real with about what we really need, because maybe what we really need is to be touched. And I remembered a part of what inspired this story. In part, my mother was in hospice and for 6 weeks. And one day I was leaving out and I saw this guy who was a dead ringer for this guy that I went to middle school with, named Charles McWhite. And I wouldn't have seen him since we were like 12 years old. And I just, kind of had that stuck in the moment. And I saw that guy later, and his mom's room was across from my mom's room. So I was imagining sort of what was happening over there. And then one day I came down the hall and her room was empty. And I was just thinking about how and now somebody else's mother will be in that room. And it's just like this churning, and we're in this proximity having a parallel experience, but there's no connection in it. And I was like, so what if two people connected in that way? The other impetus for the story was when I was 19, 20, a dear friend of mine, her father died. And looking back, I see that she grieved in ways that were considered inappropriate and unorthodox. Like nobody would have called it grief. I didn't see it as grief. And I feel like I failed her. And I've had to show myself grace. Like we were both like 19, 20. Like I didn't know what I was doing with life either. So I was probably doing the best that I could. But in retrospect, it was like, oh, once my mom died, I was 34. I was like, I get it now that you don't just sit and wear black and cry. Like that's not how grief shows up, and there's no timeline. There are all these things that we get wrong about grief that cause us to fail to show up for ourselves and for other people who are grieving. And so I wanted to write this story where two people are grieving in ways that most people wouldn't approve of, the way that they're acting on their needs in that moment. And I've been surprised at how so many readers were like, oh, this wasn't about infidelity, because, as you said, the guy was married. This is a story about grief. Yeah. And I think, how stories are like a Rorschach test. It's like, do you see a guy cheating on his wife, or do you see two people being, huddled together to keep warm in, the icy winds of grief are upon them,
Yeah. If I hadn't gone through my own grief moments in my own life, some of the micro details you mentioned, I would have just read it like, you mentioned so many details. You just gave your own personal story to that. And now it made so much sense, like why those details were there. When I read it was just hitting so home, like, wow, man. Like,
because and I hope that people who are grieving, who read it, feel less alone, because when you're in the midst of that, you're surrounded by people who care, hopefully, but you feel so lonely because there are parts of it where you are utterly alone, except for people who have been through it.
To this day, so many people come to me. They were at my grandmother's funeral, right? She was a very famous person where I'm from. It's a big, huge funeral. I don't recall any of those faces.
Gone.
I remember just floods of people coming up, shaking my hand, floods of people they coming by. It's just like a hurricane. Like I don't remember any of it.
The brain on grief is it kind of snaps a little bit. Like for my mom, when my mom died, I was experiencing a lot of there were people who wanted me to handle certain things the way they wanted me to handle it. So I felt like, you know what, it's damned if I do, damned if I don't. Down to, she was one denomination. Let's say she went to a Baptist church and she wanted her pastor to preach her funeral, and their church was being renovated. And my mom said to me when she was still lucid, she was like, and they were meeting in a school cafeteria. She said, you bet not hold my funeral in no school cafeteria. No, promise. Absolutely not. It will be in a church. So one of my mom's coworkers said, my pastor welcomes you to have the funeral at the church, because it couldn't just be any church, because it was going to be a big funeral. We had 2 viewings. That's how many people we knew were going to be at the funeral. And so this AME pastor welcomed my mother's Baptist pastor into his pulpit to preach. Do you know her pastor was feeling some kind of way about it? I said, you know what? Don't preach it then. I'll find somebody. But I couldn't believe my mother is dead, and you in your feelings right now. So I was so over people, and my mind, and my children were with me. They were like 1 and 6 at the time. And I just remember thinking, I cannot sweat at my mother's funeral. I don't know why. That was my thing. So I wore a sleeveless cocktail dress. It was above the knee. I also decided it was a good idea to wear these backless slide heels that were strappy. Like, I looked like I was going to a cocktail party.
You're going to brunch. You're going to brunch.
But I was not gonna. I mean, obviously, I was sweating, but I don't know. I was worried about sweat stains. But I don't know. But I was like, I can't have sleeves, and that's what I decided to wear to my mother's funeral. And I could feel the disapproval, of people, and I didn't care. But like, that's where grief took me. That I couldn't. I think the only way I could survive that day was, guess what? I did not have sweat stains. That's where my brain was.
Congratulations.
Right?
Yeah. Touchdown. Right?
And like you, I don't know who was there. I don't know who.
I don't. Yeah, I don't. The next story I want to talk about. This is the hardest story for me. Mm-hmm. The peach cobbler story.
Oh, yeah.
Back to psychology. So first of all, the peach cobbler story, and then the instructions
for married Christian husbands.
So those 2 stories, did you write those stories as like one story, or did you write the peach cobbler and then come back later and write another story?
So peach cobbler was first, long before that. Peach cobbler in that when I was trying to get those 3 stories published, that my agent was like, that will be the thing that allows us. So, and peach cobbler was rejected everywhere of all the stories.
That story?
That's what I'm saying about being subjective, right?
That's like the no-brainer. That's like the home run. That's like the
no, did not get published. So it had been written. Crazy. It was done. And then Instructions for Married Christian Husbands was the last story I wrote.
See, that makes sense.
I had written like months, a year, I don't know how long, but a long time before I knew I was doing a collection, I started writing this story, a traditional narrative about a woman who has serial affairs with married men who are Christians. And that first paragraph that's like, you, the infantilized husbands of godly Christian women, are low-hanging fruit, blah, 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 blah. I wrote that and didn't touch it for a while. Came back again, didn't know I was writing a book, wrote 20 pages of who is, trying to figure out who is this woman and sort of who is her latest catch and how did she meet him and all of that stuff. And the first time he came to her house, I wrote all of that, 20 pages. So the book is due. I got one more story to write. This is going to be the story. I'm looking at it and I'm like, I don't have anything fresh to say, right? Like, oh, somebody catches feelings. We've done that before. No, but I don't even care about that. The catching feelings. Oh, they get caught. That's not interesting to me either. And like Dontil said, I have to be interested. I have to like it. So I wasn't getting anything. So I was talking to a friend of mine, and we were the social media meme of the day was these women made these T-shirts that said, "I heart her husband," and we were like, "That's bold." And so we started riffing on that. Like, there should be like a side chick academy. Like, there are rules. Like, you don't make T-shirts like this, or this is how you stay in your lane if this is what you're going to do. Then the next day, some other enterprising woman came out with a shirt that said, "But I have his 401k." And so we laughed about that. Like, oh, the two women are like fighting. But like, then it was like, there's more to this. It's not just funny. because why is it about these two women and like the guy is just off doing whatever, and he's the one that's holding all the power. We even the way we talk about the women that these men will have affairs with, they're marginalized. They're literally the side chick. They're off to the side. And so I started playing what if, which is a thing I do when I'm stuck, which is, well, what if she was at the center? What if the side chick was in the center? What if she got to make the rules? And what if it was a literal rule book? Because I also like to play with form. And then that's how we got instructions. So I kept
man, that rule book is like Biggest Smalls 10 crack commandments.
That commandment.
Yes. Yeah.
So I kept that first paragraph.
Wait a minute.
That first paragraph, you, the infantilized husbands of godly Christian women, are low-hanging fruit, blah, 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 blah. And it's basically like, you want to get with me? Here are the rules. And so, I'm laying out the rules, as they come to me. And then it's like, oh, wait, who is she? Right? Because that, so she's going to give some basics about her. And she's like, I own a bakery. And this line came to me, I make the best peach cobbler in town. And I was like, oh my God, it's Olivia. I hadn't planned it. I had not planned it.
Billy is in the chat, Sister Billy. We're in the book club together, and we're all reading this book last year together. And it's like, wait a minute. That's the same? Is that the same?
It's her. I was as surprised as y'all. And then, but the beautiful thing that happened after that is like, oh, I already know her backstory. I knew her whole childhood, right? And so I think what happened was I was happy with the ending of Peach Cobbler, but the way it ends, you'll recall, is Olivia's like, I had nowhere to go. She's stuck. And I think there was a part of me that even though I created this whole world, it was like, dang, what happened to her? Like, I didn't feel the need to write it at that time. But there was this question. And I think that part of my heart that was worried about Olivia, she just piped up like, here I am. Here's what happened to me. And then it kind of posed, it created for that story instructions, a really interesting question. Like, did she land on her feet? Is she better off than her mom? Right. And I don't want to answer those questions for readers. I just want to stir those questions up.
Put my little psychology hat on, right?
Yeah, see?
So what was the emotional and mental impact of what she went through with her mother,
right,
and that pastor, that landed her at the back of the book with the instructions? And because she mentioned the whole fingers thing a good bit about hands and the size of hands. And
yes,
I remember that moment she saw the pastor with her mom and all that.
Yeah,
was that a part of that?
Thank you. I'm gonna take credit. Sure, yeah, No, I think. I have an obsession with hands. I am absolutely obsessed with hands. So I think it shows up, subconsciously for me. So I did not plan that. But what's fun for me is that, I think what happened to her between Peach Cobbler and instructions is that she didn't moralize about what her mother did, other than she did not forgive her mother for having her tutor the pastor's son and be in that his wife's house like that. But what she saw was, she was dependent on this man.
Yep.
And so Olivia was like, I'm not depending. And in fact, I'm making the rules of engagement. I will see you on my terms, not I'm gonna see you because I need you to pay my light bill. So in Olivia's mind, she is not falling victim to what her mother did. The beautiful thing is I'm working on the TV adaptation for Church Ladies, and my co-writer and I chose Olivia to be one of the main characters. We've aged her now. She owns her bakery. She's still sleeping with married men. She has a teenage daughter with a man who is married. But then we brought Jael in from that story and made it where they were best friends as teenagers. And Jael went to Olivia when she killed a pedophile to help her cover up the crime. And now we are 20 years later. And you got to watch the show to see what happens next.
Uh, so I did have a TV show question in here. You kind of went there just now. Do you imagine the cast already, like casting these characters? Have you got to that point in your mind?
We haven't done it officially, and I don't want to say because I don't want anybody to feel put out, but there is a particular actress that when I see Olivia grown up, I picture her. I picture her. I would love for it to be her. But my co-writer and I have bounced around some other names, and then Tessa Thompson and I have created. I created a wish list, and we shared some names of people who would be just dream cast, in the show. Andre Holland, Steven Soderbergh told him about Church Ladies, and he read it, and he posted it on his Instagram with his birthday cake a couple of years ago. And then I got to meet him at Tessa's birthday party a couple of years ago, and he was like, I'm all in, Church Ladies, whatever you want me to do. So I adore him. I would love to see him in Church Ladies.
Now, do we have any kind of a pending date on release? Can you say anything, or is it under wraps? You can't say nothing. No.
It's still in development. I can say that, and of course, the strike slowed the strike slowed down and a slow process even further. So, but we are still in development. We survived the strike. So many adaptations that were in the works did not. So we are very, very thankful for that.
Because most of my authors come on the show, I'm always asking them a hypothetical, like if your book could be a movie, what would you? But you actually there. So what was the phone call like? Is your question? What's the phone call like? You know what? HBO Max, we gonna do it. How did you feel? What's your real response?
So what was beautiful is that I had like folks approaching me, multiple folks, just personally at first. Like a couple of Hollywood people that we were 1 degree of separation away. Who knew? Thanks to Facebook, that reached out and said, we're interested. And then my agent would talk to them, and then we were also pitching it to different places. So we had a competitive situation. And so people were making bids, and we had gotten a round of bids in. And then we were
about, you were in a bidding war.
Yeah.
These bidding wars. People say that. You were in a bidding war. Okay.
And so we were, vetting all the offers, and it was a very slow process to get back to people with the counter offers. And just as we were about to, HBO Max swooped in and was like, can you wait a day, because we want to get in on this, and we have someone attached that we think you'll be really excited about, but we can't tell you who it is for like 2 days or a day or whatever. And it was like, well, everybody else is going to be mad at us because this is taking so long, but sure, we'll wait a little while longer. And when they came in, it was with Tessa. And so we added that to the plate of offers, and ultimately I chose to go with HBO Max and Tessa.
That's awesome. That's beautiful. I can't wait to see it. I have just 2 more questions for you, my sister. Two more questions. So my last literal book question is about the mother-daughter dynamics, like the Peach Cobbler story, and then once again the Eddie Reverse story. There's sometimes difficulty in mother-daughter relations. I know a few people in my personal life that they have very complex mother-daughter situations. Talk about once again the psychology of that and like them dealing with that. Because my 3rd time reading the book, right? Realizing the Peach Cobbler story, the husband's wife, when she goes to the house, the husband's wife, that's the most she's being touched for the most part.
Yeah.
Her own mother doesn't really touch her at all. Don't really laugh with her. Don't nothing. This other lady does all those things with her.
Exactly.
Trying to joke with her and be light and trying to embrace. And she's kind of like, So talk about the mother-daughter dynamic.
Like, how we were saying earlier, how grief just creeps in, and you don't always recognize it for what it is. It wasn't until I turned the manuscript in that I was like, there's a lot of mother-daughter stuff in this. In fact, it's in every story, and it clearly spoke to
you're not consciously doing it, for the record.
No.
See, we always debate, man. I bet she did this and then she did that.
No.
So
And
you writers are not sitting there like, ha ha ha, the
well,
evil genius.
sometimes, I mean, some things are orchestrated. Like I'm working on a new collection, and one thing I noticed about Church Ladies is that not only was it mother daughter all the way through, but it was all from the perspective of the daughters, right? And I was like, huh, I wonder what that's about. And because I'm also a mother of daughters, and I'm like, I wonder if it's because my relationship mothering my daughters is still very much active, whereas my mother is deceased. And also, I think about my daughter's privacy and things like that. And so, I write about them. When they were little, I was a blogger. And so I wrote about them, I think, way too much. But I noticed that I was like very much about the daughter perspective. So with some news stories, I was intentional. I did say, okay, I'm going to focus on some mother perspectives as well, and that was intentional. But for mother daughter stuff, it surprised, I mean, for Church Ladies, I was not conscious of it. I also thought, like, because when my mother died, like, we said all the things that we had wanted to say, but what writing Church Ladies showed me was that there was still a lot of um, tenderness and tension. And there were things that, oh yeah, I wish we could have talked about that. Or there's this thing that really bugged me. Or in the case of the last story in the book, when Eddie Levert comes, I'm really pulling myself away and imagining what things were like for my mother and my grandmother, because they each took care of mothers who became ill, mothers whom they had a difficult relationship with, mothers who were not the mothers they needed them to be. And I remember being in college and then out of college when all that was happening. I was like, peace out. Y'all got that. I'm good. Because they all three generations were in the same house. And when I came to visit, it was four generations in the house. And I'm like, I'm not living here. And so, so not only are you trying to take care of, being a caretaker is hard, full stop, but then caretaking someone who didn't take care of you the way you wanted to be taken care of. And then, oh, what if she doesn't even know who you are? And that was the case with my grandmother, my great grandmother. My great grandmother at a certain point just had no recollection of who anyone was, including her daughter. And they had a difficult relationship. So in that regard, I was interested in exploring that, but without even being really super conscious of it, other than this woman, her mother is talking about Eddie Levert. Eddie Levert was my mother's favorite singer, like hands down. That picture where the mother has a picture with Eddie Levert. My mother had a picture with Eddie Levert. Except so, but in that story, I'm nowhere in that story. I'm looking at my mother and my grandmother in that story, but I'm giving them these different, facets from our lives. But yeah, it's all over. It's all over.
Man, thanks for that insight. We
Mhm.
appreciate it. So the last question I want to ask is about the podcast, man.
Yeah.
You, the brother Kiese, the podcast is a grand slam. Anybody watching this show right now, please go over and check out their podcast on all of your podcasting platforms. It is amazing. I love what you have going on. I'm
Thank
planning
you.
to driving home from work in the morning. I work at night. I'm driving home in the morning.
Yes.
Loving it, getting so many insights from it. So tell
Mhm.
me about like the creation of the podcast.
Sure.
Y'all,
Mhm.
y'all coming in. You know what? We're gonna do this thing. How
Yeah.
did that formulate?
So we actually, Kiese and I started first talking about doing a podcast together in like 2018. But as you know, like it takes a lot of tech, a lot of editing, production, all that stuff. And we were like, we don't want to do that part. We just want to talk to each other and writers that we love. And so we're like, oh, I guess we need a producer. We found a producer. We didn't have the same vision that those producers had, so that kind of was tabled. And then a couple of years ago, Donnie Walton and Mark Armstrong approached me. They had formed a company called Ursa Story, and they wanted to create a podcast and an audio production company devoted solely to the short story. So while you're all checking out Wreck and True Stories, which is our newest podcast, our original is Ursa Short Story, Ursa Short Fiction. I always get the name wrong. Also on Spotify. So Donnie and I were, doing that show. We did 2 seasons. We're launching our 3rd season in September. And we, I was a co part owner of Ursa, and then retroactively became a co-founder in addition to co-hosting the podcast. And so the three of us, Donnie and Mark and I, were like, okay, so what's next for us? Like, what do we want to do? Live events? Do we want to expand in some way? And so we wanted to keep our devotion to short stories, because there's not enough of anything devoted to short stories. So we didn't want to change that, but we wanted to expand. And so we're like, well, what about nonfiction? And they asked if I would be interested in co-hosting another podcast. And if so, who would I want to co-host with? Not a question. Kiese did not hesitate. And thankfully he said yes. With all the other things, that he has going on, he said yes. And then we sat down and just, we have a huge list of people that we want to talk to, and I wish we could talk to like 10 times more, or we would never write though if we did.
Yeah.
And so, we put together a first season, and we were pretty informal. Like, we just wanted to do what he and I do anyway, which is talk about writing and the writers that we love. And so we interviewed some of them. And we also have a few episodes this season that we recorded where we don't have a guest, right? So our first episode was just us chopping it up about essays. And then Tuesday, in a couple of days, we're going to have another one where we're talking about mothers and fathers and writing about family.
See, here we go.
Right.
That's crazy.
Yeah,
That's
it's probably the most vulnerable vulnerable episode of the season. They shared it, with the producers. Everybody shared it in email, and like, oh, we love it. And I'm like, I'll listen with the rest of the world. I don't like my nerves. I don't think I can listen to it right now. Because it's very personal. It's very, very personal.
Yeah. You mentioned your list of guests that you have and that you want to have. Mm-hmm. One of my questions for you was, give me a guest that like you would get nervous about. Like for me, you're that guest for me. Like,
oh my God,
I'm like, man, Saturday, I barely slept last night. This anticipation, the nerves.
Yes.
Who is that for you? That you like, man? Okay, it's game day. I got to get it.
Sure. I think I handled it well. I don't think I showed up nervous, but Roxane Gay, even though I know her, even though, we've talked, we've laughed, all of those things, I think I was probably most nervous about her because I have just been in awe of her for so long and didn't know her until recently. And so I think there's still some of that, it's Roxane, so there was some of that. I was also nervous for Alexander Chi because I don't really know Alexander. We're connected on social media, and he's been super supportive of me, and I've been supportive of him. But that was our first time ever speaking. And so he and Kiese had more of a connection, but I didn't know what the energy would be like. And I also didn't want to, I just see him as, and Roxane say, all of our guests, but that sense of like, I don't want to ask like a question that's considered, flaky or flighty or whatever. And not knowing him, I didn't know how certain questions would land or whatever, but he was just as fun as everybody else. And eventually, very quickly, I was able to relax. Yeah.
Okay. So before you leave, one last thing about nonfiction.
Okay.
So a lot of these book spaces, they tend to be heavy on fiction. That's what it is. So there's even a lot of memes and reels like clowning nonfiction and talking down on nonfiction. Give us, what does nonfiction like mean to you? What's the importance of nonfiction in your world? What you would say?
Well, before I answer that, I'm going to say I've heard it is like the opposite, especially like there are men. Like I think was it Yadon Israel that just had a thing on about getting more men to read fiction because there are men who are like, we just want to read stuff that's real. And I when I was,
That's
a
crazy.
to date, I would meet men who were like, I never read fiction. I just read like instruction manuals and like tech magazines, like real stuff, facts.
Wow.
And I'm like,
Wow.
wow, there's not
Wow.
a lot happening in your world, and you're not imagining anything. So I don't. So that I've seen the opposite, but
Okay.
so nonfiction, I think, the expansiveness of it we try to capture on our podcast, which is it could be anything from an essay, a personal essay in like the New Yorker. I'm thinking of Addie Sitchin's recent essays. She's had well, no, she's had a story and an essay in the New Yorker. There's also Danielle Smith's piece about Puffy, you
Mm-hmm.
know
Mm-hmm.
that's so not it's this broad umbrella. And I'm like, and so when you said that, I'm like, how can people not like nonfiction when it captures so much? And then you also have, traditional journalism, you have narrative journalism, you have memoir. I had the opportunity to write some micro essays. I'm putting together my bookshelf. So I have this right here. It's this non
Okay.
woman, which is a Audre Lorde quote. It's taken from an not Audre Lorde, Lucille Clifton quote from one of her poems. And this
Yeah.
is a collection of 131 micro essays on being in the world. And I have 3 little essays in here. So,
Wow.
what's the difference between like a micro essay and a poem, a narrative poem?
Mhm.
So
I like that.
genre is tricky,
I like that.
but yeah, so there's so many possibilities
Yeah.
with nonfiction. There are the hermit crab essays, which I absolutely love. You know how a hermit crab makes a home of anything. It could take a bottle cap
Mm-hmm.
and make a home. So you take a form, instructions, a job application, a college syllabus, and you write an essay using that form. That's a hermit crab essay.
Yeah.
So it's
You got
so
the whole class right now. Keep going.
so
What? Hermit
there's a
crab
book
essay.
called I think it's called The Shell Game, where I think it's a collection of hermit crab essays, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm about to
Um,
be all day. Like, I gotta go find.
so I think there's so many rich possibilities. And then of
Yeah.
course, all of the things you love about fiction, you find in the best essays, all those storytelling
Mhm.
elements, right? We talk about how in writing even memoir, you become a character, the other people become characters. You have to have, a story, whether it's an arc, there's some shape to the story that you're telling. Maybe it's not an arc, maybe it's a zigzag, maybe, whatever form you want that story to take. Maybe it's braided. You can do these same things in fiction, but you can do them in nonfiction. So it's not, people are like, oh, well, nonfiction, you're limited because you don't, you can't use imagination, but that
What?
doesn't stop you from telling a good story.
Have they read Clinton Smith? Have they read Imani Perry? I can
Exactly.
name. Like, are you
Exactly.
serious?
I mean, just looking at Amani's body of work and
Yeah,
the different
that's so
forms that it
right.
takes. Yes, it's
Right.
all nonfiction, but
Whenever I speak to a person about their dislike of nonfiction or their assumption, they
mhm,
think it's gonna be like dry and just facts and just
mhm.
facts, just data. But
Because
like,
that's what we were taught in school, and that's what we read, too many of us in school.
yeah. But I
Absolutely.
love the crop of today's writers. Like I said,
Yeah.
Eden X Kendi, and I can name a bunch of guys that they
Mhm.
make it like it's just
Yeah.
it's
Samantha
it
Irby.
reads so fast. It reads like, man,
Yeah,
it don't feel like a dry, boring thing.
exactly. Samantha Irby, who's one of our guests and someone I absolutely adore, has several memoirs that are hilarious and poignant in some places, but mostly hilarious. Um, and she is singular at what she does. There's no one else doing what Sam
Wow,
Irby is doing.
wow, wow, wow. I would even say the last 3 years reading way more fiction than ever in my life.
Mm-hmm.
The 12 to 15 years that I did spend reading nonfiction,
Mm-hmm.
it helped me enjoy the fiction I'm reading right now.
Mm-hmm.
I
Good.
wouldn't read certain stories the way I read it only because I know the real part of where this might have come from.
Yes.
When I'm in the book club with my friends, I'm like, oh, Toni Morrison said this. Did you realize?
Mm-hmm.
she's talking about flight, and then back in Africa they talked about flight, and then it's like a connection that I probably would never make if I didn't read the nonfiction I read for all these years.
You know what's wild that I didn't
Mhm.
know, that I didn't anticipate?
Mhm.
Church Ladies, which is fictional, was fact checked.
It was fact
For
check.
editors, it was fact checked
It was
because
fact check.
it's fictional, but it still needed to ring true. So like I don't know how
I'm
the
trying to
process
imagine the moment in the book, like you fact check
just
the
making
peace
sure that
conference.
it could. So, for example, so this is one thing they tried to fact check, but they couldn't. They had to come back to me and say, "Can you just, are you sure about this?" Because they couldn't verify it. That a dozen crabs, medium crabs, cost $7 in Jacksonville, Florida, in 1985.
Are you serious?
Because I think it might have been in Gile or so one of the stories. They're talking about how much the crabs cost, but they also fact check the science in how to make love to a physicist. So the actual physicist that I had a crush on that helped me with the science, because I interviewed him, and by two things: one, about his religious beliefs as a scientist, but also that asked the astronomical phenomenon that I described with these black holes and the gases and all that stuff. I read about that and I was like, I think this could work. And because I'm not a science person, and I put it in the story and it fit. And I was like, I think I understand the science. But I asked him, I was like, can you read this for me and make sure that I got the science right? And so I said something about the distance between this and this. And he said, it's distances plural, the distance between this and this and this and this. And I added that into the story where Eric corrects Lyra because she gets that wrong and he corrects it.
Nice.
So when I turned the book in, they were like, the last thing they did was they sent the story, How to Make Love to a Physicist, to the physicist department at West Virginia University and asked them to read it to make sure that I
This
got the
is
science right.
crazy. In a fictional book. This is you gave so many nuggets in this one interview, like.
And that's why people cannot
Who
be
would
lying
say that?
about and making stuff. I mean, so like if you want to write
Who would
speculative
say
fiction,
that?
cool. But if you're writing realistic fiction, I don't know if every publisher does this,
Right.
but they
You are
did.
blowing my mind right now. I would never. Wow. That was a nugget drop right there. I would never. Well,
That's
I
why
think
I don't
you.
understand how people get away with lying in memoir. I'm like, they fact check my fiction. They didn't fact check your
Yes.
life.
Right. Well, my book club and I, we enjoyed your science. I tell you that. Yeah,
Thank
we had
you.
fun with the science. I tell you that.
Thank you.
So once again, thank you very, very much for coming
Oh,
on the
this has been
show.
great.
This has
Thank
been fun as I imagined it would be for almost a year in the making. I
thank you.
appreciate you. Thank you. And I want to tell you this on the camera. Your team is amazing.
Oh,
Your
they're
team,
great.
the responses, the timeliness, it was awesome. I want to tell you that to give them props and
All
credit
right. I will pass that on.
on the
Thank you.
camera. They were amazing, man. So
Thank you
thank
so
you
much.
very much. Look forward to all of her wonderful things coming. A lot of irons in the fire. Deesha Philyaw. See y'all next time on the Sean P. Experience, sitting with the Griots. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I